what the meaning. And remember that the overall meaning of the poem is not necessarily the logical or the literal meaning. Okay, so when I'm talking about the meaning or the message of the poem, I'm not talking about the literal meaning. I'm talking about what the poet wants you to come away feeling and believing. So if I've got a Shakespearean sonnet about a rose, I don't really think that Shakespeare wrote that so that I would have more education about a rose. I think that he's asking me to think about my concept of beauty and my idea of age and my idea of what is important in life. Okay? Do you see that? I hope you see the distinction there. But if I was to just literally paraphrase it, it would be about a rose and how the rose lives, and then the rose dies, and oh, woe is me. Okay, that's the literal message of the poem, but I think the actual message for me as the reader is going to be something different. All right, so when you're looking at the logic of the passage, it's how it's flowing and if there's any gaps there. Um, excuse me. Any tensions or contradictions, anything that seems to be strange to you, you want to note that because that can be helpful. All right. Language. Language is going to be so important to you in a close reading. And I would guess that the vast majority of you are going to spend most of your time talking about the language. And there's lots of different ways that you can talk about language. So I want you to keep these in the back of your mind as you're reading your poems and as you're choosing a poem. Choose one that is rich in language and rich in things that are going to help you. So the first thing is keywords or phrases. So look at the language that the author is using. Is there anything that jumps out at you? Sometimes a word will just jump out at you because it's strangely placed. Sometimes it will jump out at you because it's an interesting word, maybe a word that someone, made up. Or maybe it will jump out at you because it seems like it's used in a strange way. Like, I guess that sort of fits there, but that's a strange word to choose for that particular meaning. Anytime that a word is kind of highlighted in any way, sometimes it can be something that someone says over and over again. Sometimes it can be something that is highlighted at the end of a line. Anything that is repeated, those are all things that should jump out at you. Okay, so pay attention to those and figure out why use that language? Why use that word? What is that word doing, and how is it contributing to the expression of that overall meaning? What the poet wants me to believe and come away hearing. All right, connotation and pun. So if the poet is playing with language and using a language in a kind of ironic way, using a word in a way that maybe it doesn't normally get used, using a pun or playing with language, maybe using a word that could have different meanings given the situation. That's called connotation. If any of those sort of jump out at you, that can be something. And I give an example here about suns and suns. Sometime when we're talking about the sun in the sky, we can also be talking about a sun like an heir or a child, or you can kind of see how that kind of play on language might be something that you'd want to pay attention to. All right, the other elements of language that you might want to consider are metaphors and imagery. Okay, so metaphors and similes are always going to be things that you want to pay attention to. There's a reason that the poet is comparing something to something else. And so whenever you see that, you want to ask yourself, okay, what's the relationship between those two things? Especially extended metaphors, which is like a metaphor that carries on through the entire poem or a long part of the poem. That's always an important thing. An extended metaphor is always purposeful and it's always crafted very carefully. So you want to ask yourself, why would a poet spend so much time comparing this thing to this thing? And what's the relationship there? And what does that relationship tell me about what the poet is trying to communicate? The other thing is imagery. And so imagery is not necessarily symbolism. It's a bit of a symbol, but it's just these sort of verbal pictures that we've got, okay? And so imagery is not just objects. Sometimes people want to say, oh, this is imagery because it's an object. No, an imagery is like something where, I'm talking about a rose and I'm giving you all of these qualities of the rose, okay? I'm describing it in great detail. That's imagery, where the poet is purposely trying to get you to see the rose in the way that he or she sees the rose. That's imagery. Just mentioning a rose is not imagery. Okay, it has to extend beyond that. Okay, so a lot of times metaphor and imagery will go hand in hand, right? Because if you're trying to compare one thing to another thing, then you're going to be describing those things in more detail than maybe you would if you were just sort of mentioning a rose in passing. So I give you lots of examples here, like familiar metaphor, the rose for love. So all the different questions that you can kind of ask yourself. Okay, so that is language. I also want you to consider the form of the poem, okay? Some poems are in very rigid form, like sonnet form, which has a prescribed format. It's 14 lines. It has a quatrain and a sestet, or it has all of these different elements of the octave and a sestet. I'm sorry, octave and a sestet. I knew I had that wrong. It has, it's in iambic pentameter. That's the Shakespearean sonnet anyway. It's in iambic pentameter. It's usually A, B, C, D, C, D, and then D, E, D, E, F, G, F, G. Okay, so there's a form, right, for a sonnet, but that's not always true. Sometimes we've got forms that aren't forms. And so, but it doesn't matter. The question is, how is the poet using the form? So is the poet using that sonnet form and that kind of rigid rhyme scheme and that rigid syllable count and all of these things so that he or she can communicate something particularly? Does it help to kind of keep everything restrained and help us to see something in a restrained way? The flip side could be true if someone has kind of a free form, no rhyme, uses space in a really interesting way. These are all things that you want to ask yourself. These are all important questions. It's not just something to be discounted. Just because someone doesn't use a rhyme scheme doesn't mean like, woohoo, I don't have to talk about rhyme scheme. No, you can talk about the fact that there is no rhyme scheme, and you can ask yourself, how does that help to contribute to the meaning? So if I'm talking about a sonnet that is talking about life and death, and it's within this very prescribed, rigid format, I might suggest that using that sonnet format and keeping that very rhythmic kind of format, that rhythmic form, those really tightly constructed iambic pentameter lines, might be a way of suggesting how rhythmic life is, how life has a cycle, and it goes heartbeat by heartbeat, and you have this, and it goes and it goes and it goes, and then it ends. It starts and it ends, and you have this limited amount of time and space. That might be something that I could make meaning out of based on the form. You always want to consider the form. It's not always going to be something that you want to talk about for a long time, but it's certainly something to think about as you're looking for evidence about how the poem's form and content and elements are constructed to create this kind of meaning that you think that the poet is trying to communicate. All right. Always want to consider the speaker and the tone also of the poem. If there is a particular speaker, which isn't always true, you want to consider the way the speaker is approaching it. I want to caution you, though, to not always assume that the speaker is the author, okay? Whenever you are discussing some kind of literature, you always want to assume, unless the author tells you differently, that the speaker is a fictional construct, meaning it's not the author itself, him or herself. Because a lot of times people are using a form that's kind of like a monologue, but it's not the poet who's talking. It's just this figure that they have imagined who is speaking. That's not always the case, but it's always the safe place to start. And then if you see evidence that there is it is in fact the author who is speaking, then you can suggest that. But it's always important to think about the speaker as something entirely fictional unless you see evidence otherwise. And that's true not just in poems, but in short stories and in plays themselves. All right. Okay. So those are the basic gists of what you want to look for when you're looking at a poem. So let's just look at a poem. I think it's a poem that you're going to be reading if you haven't already read it. All right, so this is one of my favorite poems, mainly because I think it's kind of crazy. I love E.E. Cummings because E.E. Cummings plays with language and plays with form and doesn't prescribe to any rules of punctuation or of capitalization or of sentence structure at all. And that can make it really fun to try to figure out what the meaning is. So this is In Just Spring. Well, it's called In Just, but I always think of it as In Just Spring. But I want you to look at the form, okay? So the first thing, well, let's read it first and then we'll look at the form. And I'm not going to suggest answers here, but I'm just going to suggest things that you might look for and look at as you were analyzing this, because somebody may want to do this poem as their paper. All right. I don't want like 4,000 papers on In Just, though, by E. Cummings, just because we went over it. I understand that some of you may be really excited about this poem now that you've read it and you think it's great and you want to talk about it and have great ideas, and I think that's great. But this is not a mandate that you have to do an E. E. Cummings poem just because I like E. E. Cummings. I like lots of people. So, okay. In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, the little lame balloon man whistles far, and we and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies in its spring. When the world is puddle wonderful, the queer old balloon man whistles far, and we and Betty and Isabel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far, and we. And you'll notice that I read it in a particular way. Whenever you read it out loud, you kind of have to interpret how the form is giving you some clues. So I, for example, created large spaces or pauses right here because there were large spaces there. So the first thing that we're going to do in any kind of close reading is try to figure out what is this poem about, okay? So we've got this first section that talks about the world being mud luscious, and you have people who, little Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isabel, and they're doing things like dancing, hopscotch, jump rope, marbles, piracies, and mentioning many times the idea of spring. So I think that word spring is mentioned 1, 2, 3 times in a relatively short poem. So that would be my first clue that, okay, I think this is about spring. And it's kind of like a snapshot of someone's experience of spring. Okay? So to me, that's the literal meaning of the poem. This is what springtime is like, wherever this person was.